History tells the story of the world and of our lives. Sometimes that history goes bump in the night. Broadcasting from the center of Oddity and the supernatural in Central Florida, it's the History Goes Bump podcast.
Hello, you spooktacular people. Welcome to this 547th episode of the History Goes Bump podcast. Ghost Tours for the Theater of the Mind. I'm your host, Diane.
And this is Kelly.
Kelly, on this episode, we are featuring another location that we've been to. As a matter of fact, we don't usually do this, but this is going to be a two-parter. This is our Haunted Outer Banks series.
Woohoo!
Yes, we had to break it into two, otherwise it was going to be far too long. So on this one, we're going to cover the lower islands. On the next one, it will be the upper islands. And we got to go through all of them on this trip.
It was such a fun time.
And I don't know that we had really any experiences, but we did see a number of haunted locations and a lot of historical places as well. And we have some great stories to share with you. Before we get into that, we want to welcome into the Spooktacular crew, Megan, Meghan, Lilith, Gabe, and Corey with an EY.
Thank you so much for joining the Spooktacular crew.
And now, this moment in Oddity.
The moment in Oddity was suggested by Michael Rogers. In Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, there's a unique home which garners the attention of tourists, if not the locals themselves. It is considered a Southside landmark and was established in 1983. A Scottish dentist, Ken Wallace, added on to the two-car garage area above his Lendrum home. The addition appears castle-like, complete with suits of armor. The space is a bonus room of sorts, and it houses Wallace's collection of antique furniture and has stained glass windows. The homeowner used the lower portion of the building as his dental office, but he desired additional space where his daughters could play. They were the reason why he added the castle-themed portion to his property. When Dr. Wallace retired, he sold his home to his oldest daughter, who now works as a dental hygienist out of the home. They even have an old dental sink in the front yard. Wallace's youngest granddaughters enjoy playing in the castle area, while his teenage step-granddaughter hangs out there with her friends. The castle-like structure may catch tourists' eyes, but apparently the interior is equally interesting. According to the Edmonton Journal, there's a fireplace along with two huge antique sideboards and an antique sofa, plus a row of throne-like chairs. A small spiral staircase leads to a loft, and an even smaller staircase from there ends in a tiny solarium with a trap door that opens out on top of the garage. The castle is decorated for the holidays yearly, and the family celebrates Christmas within its walls. Castles are unique in their structure, but finding a castle as a second-story addition in a modern-day neighborhood certainly is odd.
Hello, this is Victoria from victoriaslift.com. When I'm not taking those who must choose their destiny for a ride on the lift, I'm listening to History Goes Bump podcast. History isn't boring, it's terrifying. The past remains with us, and so do its spirits. Can you hear them calling? They want you to know their stories. Listen now to their voices and the truth from the past.
And now, this month in history.
In the month of July, on the 17th in 1902, the first air conditioner was invented. And boy, are we thankful for that. Talk about a hot summer. The inventor's name was Willis Carrier, and he became known as the father of air conditioning. Carrier came from modest beginnings, but with his determination and creative problem-solving methodologies, he created an innovation that performed what once was thought to be impossible. Controlling the temperature of an indoor environment prior to Carrier's invention often relied upon the architecture of a home. A building could utilize large windows and high ceilings for cross-ventilation, while deep eaves and large trees would shade porches to help keep the structure cooler. Even cupolas held a cooling purpose, allowing heat to escape the highest point of a home. In 1902, Willis Carrier was working at a publishing company in New York where the temperatures and humidity were a huge problem. The fluctuations in heat and humidity throughout the day would cause the paper that was being printed upon to grow and shrink, thus resulting in poor quality images. Willis submitted his air conditioning drawings to the publishing company, which marked the birth of air conditioning with humidity control. This led authorities in the field to standardize 4 major functions that AC must perform: control temperature, control humidity, control air circulation and ventilation, and cleanse the air. After a few years of refinement and testing, Willis Carrier was granted his U.S. patent in 1906 with the description of an apparatus for treating air.
The Outer Banks stretch for 200 miles from southeastern Virginia to Shackleford Banks in North Carolina. The Atlantic that borders its eastern side is known as the graveyard of the Atlantic because of the hundreds of shipwrecks that have occurred here. We traveled much of this stretch on our recent road trip and took in many of the sites while learning about the history and legends of this area. A key figure in history connected to the lower islands of the Outer Banks was Blackbeard the pirate. He came to his violent end here. There are numerous haunted locations and legends in the Outer Banks. On this first episode of our Outer Banks series, we are going to explore the history and hauntings of the lower islands.
Kelly, you and I and Jared took a road trip up through the Outer Banks in June of 2024, and our first stop in the Outer Banks after leaving Charleston was Ocracoke Island. You guys probably remember or recall, hopefully you listened to it. A couple weeks ago, we covered the USS Yorktown. That's where we stopped first, and then once we got out of Charleston, we headed on up and went out to Ocracoke Island. The island is only 16 miles long, and it's bordered by the Atlantic Ocean and Pamlico Sound. The Cape Hatteras National Seashore makes up most of the island, so the beaches are protected. The only way to get on the island is via boat, and there are ferries that will take you in your car to the island from 3 locations: Hatteras Island, Swan Quarter, and the one we took, Cedar Island. You have to make a reservation for the Swan Quarter and Cedar Island ferries, and they do cost money. It's not a whole lot. I think it was $15.
It was.
The Hatteras Island Ferry is free and runs on a first-come, first-served basis. So our advice to you is to try to get there as early as you can so that you can, be one of the first ones to get on the ferry. They also have introduced an express ferry that is for people on bike or foot. The Cedar Island Ferry dropped us off in the heart of the tourist area of the island. There are lots of places to eat and shop, and if you are interested in fishing charters or the beach, this is the spot for you. I mean, there are a ton of charters that go out fishing.
Oh, absolutely. We watched them coming in and cleaning the fish while we were eating at that one restaurant.
Yeah, we were having dinner and I was like, wow, there's a really strong fish smell. I mean, I know we're like right here on the waterfront, and then you look over and there's a table on the side there, and the guy was just, I don't know how many fish he cleaned in the time we were sitting there, and they were huge fish too. A lot of dolphin or they say it in other
Dorado.
places, mahi-mahi.
Dorado.
Is that what they call it in California? Okay. So most people around the country call it mahi-mahi. Down here in Florida, they call it dolphin. And they'll even put it up as dolphin. And the first time I saw that when I first was visiting Florida years and years and years ago, I was like, they cook dolphin here? And I realized what it was.
Ocracoke was first inhabited by Native Americans, and some of them were the Croatoan. Most indigenous people just visited the island for fishing, though. The original name was Wakakan, and eventually the W was dropped and different spellings morphed into Ocracoke. The spelling we all know today made its official appearance on a map in 1852. One of the most infamous and colorful characters to call Ocracoke home was Edward Teach, whom most of us know as Blackbeard. Ocracoke was one of his favorite places to hide out, and it would be here that he would come to his end during a naval battle in the Ocracoke Inlet. This was on November 22, 1718. British Naval Lieutenant Robert Maynard was tasked by the Virginia governor at the time to track down Blackbeard. Maynard took 2 small sloops to Ocracoke following a tip he had gotten that Blackbeard was anchored there. They found the pirate in an inlet that faces Pamlico Sound that is called Teach's Hole today. Blackbeard had tied one on the night before, or rather, tied on a lot the night before, and he was in no condition for a fight.
Oops, you shouldn't have gotten drunk. You're not prepared.
When he saw the sloops, he started a running battle, meaning he was heading straight for the 2 sloops, which were at the channel's mouth. The ships came close enough that Maynard and Blackbeard were able to have a conversation. This basically went with Blackbeard trying to make a deal with Maynard to just let him go, no harm, no foul. But Maynard was specifically here for Blackbeard and told him so. So Blackbeard got a glass of wine and drank damnation to Maynard and his men and said he would neither take nor give quarter. Then Blackbeard fired on the other sloop, killing the commander and several men. Several men on Maynard's sloop were wounded as well. Maynard decided to take a chance and play Blackbeard. He retreated to his quarters, hoping to get the pirate to come to him. Blackbeard lashed his ship to the sloop and boarded with his men, and they were quickly ambushed. It was a quick and harsh fight, and when the smoke cleared, Blackbeard lay dead. His men were either dead or wounded. Maynard removed Blackbeard's head, put it on the bowsprit, and took it back to Virginia. Blackbeard's body was thrown into Teach's Hole, where legend claims it took a couple laps around Maynard's sloop. People believe that Blackbeard's ghost wanders Ocracoke Island. We didn't see him swimming around the sloop.
We didn't see him on the beaches either. So I don't know if Blackbeard's really out there, but we didn't see him. We did see his flag all over the place. We even had some beer at that brewery that actually is kind of named in his honor.
Indeed.
But hell, if we could find a hat that had
Blackbeard's flag for
on
Jared.
It. Yeah, he really wanted that. And I'm like, they don't make a hat with the flag on it?
It's crazy.
It's crazy. They have it on t-shirts, but there are many historical sites to check out on the island, which we definitely did after visiting the pony pen. We had to drive all the way to the far end of the island, but we wanted to see them first. These ponies on Ocracoke arrived here via a shipwreck. There were Spanish Mustangs that managed to make it to the island, and now their descendants are kept in the pony pen. They used to roam free on the island, but as more and more people came and cars arrived, it got too dangerous for the horses. These horses are very unique. They have an unusual number of vertebrae and ribs, and they have a distinct posture and size, which is why they're referred to as ponies. They do look like they're about full size. Of course, I'm not the horse expert. You are.
They remind their body structure reminds me of an Arabian. Arabians have less vertebrae, and I believe they have less ribs too.
They don't look as big as other horses. Definitely, for sure. The National Park Service has cared for them since 1959. So we see the horses, we talked to them a little bit, and then we went back into the main part of the island and visited the David and Alice Williams house. The house was built in 1900 and is a 2-story house with a large veranda. It was built for David Williams, who was the first chief of the U.S. Coast Guard station on Ocracoke. The house was moved from its original spot to this one near the ferry dock so that it wouldn't be demolished. Can you believe they were going to demolish this house that was very, very old and had been here a long time?
No, it's so cool looking too.
It's now a museum and gift shop and home to the Ocracoke Preservation Society. There are various displays from seashells to stuff on Blackbeard to the original occupants of the house. I overheard the woman who was running the gift shop mentioning something about the place being haunted while I was out in the hallway, and I went, oh. So when we went up there to check out, I bought a couple of books there that are by a local author. We're going to get into talking about him in just a minute, and we're going to share some stories from his books. But I had to ask her. Here is us talking to her about the hauntings there.
Howard Street hauntings. Do you have the other one, Digging Up Uncle Evans?
No, does that have ghost stories too?
Do you know Phil Howard?
I don't.
He's a great guy. He's older now. His ancestors were the first owners of Ocracoke.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he came back here though as an adult, but he's an intellect.
Okay.
You know, he's very well read, studied. He has the Village Craftsman store. His daughter runs it now. Cool. So he wrote two ghost story books. The first one is Digging Up Uncle Evans. That's over there.
Okay.
That was his first. I think it's the best.
Well,
all of his stories.
I'm just going to tell you.
I think it's the best.
It's the Digging Up.
This one there's one This is a little bit more historical. Now, I just wrote another book about historical people, which is good. So the styling of this is a little bit different, maybe a little more history in it. But the best ghost stories are in it's green. There you go. It's Digging Up Uncle Evans.
Cool. Well, I like them.
But
I like history.
this has
and the ghost
one
stories.
very scary story.
Very cool.
I don't know why. I don't think everybody thinks it's so scary, but I do. It gives me the heebie-jeebies.
Well, that's good.
And I'm not a real like, sit around tell ghost stories.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm always kind of.
Well, this place is really old. Do you have weird stuff happen in here?
A couple people, like the women that take the job of being, have said yeah, and people say it's this room back here, the bedroom.
That's what I was wondering.
Oh, really? Did you get a vibe?
A little bit, yeah.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that room.
Okay.
Probably somebody attached to something in there.
Did you guys want
I mean, there's lots
Well,
of
Maybe
stuff.
the family member.
The furniture came from Portsmouth Island, one of the houses there.
Okay.
I imagine a lot of people died in that bed,
Sure.
if that means anything.
Sure.
Are you sensitive to that sort of thing?
Sometimes, a little bit. Not as much as some, but
Yeah.
Oh, but the governor of Virginia. And
Yeah. So I love the stories here. But the story in this one that gets me is the woman on the bike on Howard Street.
Okay.
Oh.
It's more modern day.
That's good.
Yeah, I know.
Should I get
You're done. Sorry.
because okay, I like little. Do you want? And I always wanted little ships.
Philip's a great guy.
Going places and seeing little ships.
We're going to do their ghost tour tonight, too.
Oh, you are? You'll hear some of the stories.
Cool.
I don't know how many you'll hear. They do 2 walks.
And I'm thinking,
One is the
like,
village
because
and
I
one
want to
is...
get little ships for, like, if I have
And Kelly, when she told us what room it was and kind of, pointed to the room behind her, you went, as people here, you were like, oh, yeah, I definitely got some weird feelings in there.
Yeah, had the feeling that if it was haunted, that's where it was mainly focused.
The author that the woman at the store was telling us about is Philip Howard. His great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, I think I got them all in there, I'm not for sure, was named William Howard. And he bought the island in 1759, and the Howard family has lived and died on this island for decades. Philip wrote 2 books of history and ghost stories, and he started the ghost tour on Ocracoke. He is retired now, but his daughter has taken up the reins, and we joined her for a ghost tour. The family owns a shop called the Village Craftsman, where local artisans sell their wares. Right across the street is the family cemetery. We shared a reel on Instagram of the cemetery in June while we were there. There are over 80 cemeteries across the island. Most are surrounded by fences, not to keep the people out, but to keep the bodies in.
Indeed, water table's quite high.
Yeah. So sometimes when they would get a little bit of flooding that would happen there, the earlier graves that they dug, since they were the men had to dig them, they weren't as deep as they should have been, and so the coffins would rise up and float on into town.
Well, the story that she shared, too, was that they would go to dig the hole for the coffin, and they'd hit water just a few inches down. So it was a matter of trying to dig it out fast enough, putting the coffin in there, and then they would stand on the coffin and jump on the coffin, trying to get it to sink down further.
Yeah.
And then maybe put a couple of inches of soil on top of that. So it's not surprising that they would become little bobbers when the flood waters would roll in.
Barely under the ground. I can't imagine just watching all the family members jumping on the coffins. Can we get it in a little bit further?
Many of the people who lived on Ocracoke in the early days were schooner captains or sailors. There was no ferry to bring people and supplies. Many of these captains would sail to other ports, and one of these men was Captain John Simon Howard. He went to Maine and brought back a young Margaret Eaton with him. They married, and as Mag got older, she got quirky. She would decorate the trees with hanging flowers and other things, and began making herself elaborate hats. Now, while these endeavors were creative, Mag was actually slipping into mental illness. Her husband came home one day to find that she had chopped one of her toes off with a meat cleaver.
Yikes.
Yeah. Another time, John came home and found a cat in the stew pot. Mag was 52 when John passed away in 1923.
So Philip Howard had written Howard Street Hauntings and Other Stories, and we'll pick up the rest of the story here as he writes it. Not infrequently, Mag wandered into nearby graveyards late at night, especially when the moon was full. With moss-covered grave markers as her only companions, Mag stood in the shadows beneath 100-year-old live oaks dripping with Spanish moss. Young men returning from late-night poker games were often startled to see Mag standing alone and silent in a long white dress in the far corner of one of the many cemeteries. She never spoke, she just stared, following passersby with her penetrating eyes. You can see why people might say, I think the cemeteries are haunted.
Yeah.
One winter evening, more than half a century after Mag died, Katie, an Island High School student, was biking past one family cemetery at dusk. The road was empty. Not a soul was in sight. No sound disturbed the early evening quiet. Just feet from the corner of the cemetery fence, Katie's bike skidded on some loose gravel, and she tumbled onto the pavement. Unhurt, Katie picked herself up, only to realize that a strange old woman with a peculiar gaze was standing by the fence, staring at her. Katie acknowledged the woman, but immediately realized that this curious crone was not about to return her greeting. Rattled, Katie quickly righted her bicycle, ready to ride away. That's when she felt a hand come to rest on her shoulder, and she looked back in a panic. The woman was gone. Katie pedaled away as quickly as she could. She believed she had a brief encounter with Mad Mag more than 50 years after Margaret Eaton died. Still today, folks wandering late at night past family cemeteries along some of the sandy lanes on Ocracoke will catch a glimpse of an unusual apparition in the far corner of the graveyard. She has long gray hair and is dressed in a white Victorian frock. Mad Mag, you might hear passersby whisper as they hurry down the lane. Ooh. Next, we headed over to the Ocracoke Lighthouse. There are 4 lighthouses, I believe, in total on the Outer Banks. You really must see them all. We did miss one of them. But this one was really cool. It's 77 feet high. It's a white tower. It was built in 1823 by architect Noah Porter. The solid brick walls were 5 feet thick at the bottom and 2 feet thick at the top. The interior isn't very big. We've been in a lot of lighthouses, Kelly. This one was small and pretty cramped.
It was thin. Yeah, thin in terms of the width.
It had this spiraling staircase in the middle that can no longer be climbed. They're just not safe. The original light was basically silvered reflectors that magnified the flame of a whale oil lamp. A Fresnel lens replaced this in 1854. In 1929, the oil lamp was replaced by an incandescent bulb, and in 1946, the lighthouse became fully automated. Lighthouse keepers stayed in a house near the lighthouse that was expanded through the years. Despite the Ocracoke Lighthouse being one of the oldest lighthouses in the country that is still in use and having keepers die on the premises, there are no hauntings reported at the lighthouse. I was like, oh, come on.
Shocking.
All lighthouses should be haunted like all jails. But there is a haunting connected to Captain Joe Merritt Burris. He was serving one winter in 1917 when his supplies ran low. The food wasn't as big a concern to him as was his chewing, and he liked to call it tobacco.
I was just going to say tobacco.
Yeah. He did not call it tobacco. Kelly, when he ran out, what did he chew?
Oh, he had to chew boat caulking.
Yeah, I don't know if it was just the sensation of having something to chew on. Could you get some gum? Or I don't know. I'm like, come on. There's no nicotine in that for sure. Anyway, Captain Joe retired and died in 1951, and it said his spirit haunts the cottage he moved into after retiring. Philip Howard recounts the following in his book, Howard Street Hauntings, about a conversation Captain Joe's nephew had with a woman who had purchased the cottage. He had a peculiar question for Anne. She's the woman who's living there now. Do you ever hear or see anything strange or unusual in your home? He inquired. Oh, yes, Anne replied. She explained that especially on nights like the present, quiet, lonely winter evenings sitting by herself in the parlor, she was sometimes startled by the sound of footsteps in one of the bedrooms on the second floor. On investigation, of course, she discovered nothing out of the ordinary. At other times, she heard the stairs creak and groan as if someone were slowly climbing to their quarters upstairs. Occasionally, she was even surprised to hear doors opening or closing, their hinges betraying a telltale squeak as they turned on their brass pins. Thank you so much, the nephew answered. I'm delighted to hear your stories. And then he proceeded to tell his tale, one he admitted that he had rarely shared with anyone else. He was just a youngster in 1951 when his uncle died, and his family had come to the island for the funeral. At that time, Ocracoke was barely known to the outside world. Access to the island was inconvenient and difficult. One could come as a passenger on the mailboat Alita from the mainland, 4 hours distance across Pamlico Sound, or, since just the year before, one could make the adventure by car on Fraser Peel's private 4-car wooden ferry. I don't know that I would do that. Get on a wooden ferry.
Oh.
With 4 cars. Across Hatteras Inlet and then drive 14 miles on the hard-packed beach into Ocracoke Village. In the village, the nephew and his family stayed at Captain Joe's house with Miss L. The next day, they walked the short distance through sandy lanes to the Methodist church for the funeral. After the graveside service and burial, nearly everyone returned to the Burris cottage to share a meal and remembrances. Island neighbors had brought so much food, and it goes on to talk about all the different, blackberry dumplings, yum. The tables and counters groaned under the weight. Plates overflowed with food, everybody's hugging, they're crying, blah, blah, blah. Late into the evening, long after the mantle of darkness had descended over the island and all but family and close friends had departed, the young nephew was sent upstairs to bed. Already in his pajamas, he walked out of the parlor and turned down the narrow hallway. At the end of the passage, he turned once again to climb the familiar wooden stairway. That is when he explained to Anne. He rushed back into the parlor, trembling and unable to speak. The color drained from his face. The adults were shocked, wondering what had frightened him so much. After calming him down and assuring him that he was safe, his parents and Aunt Elle encouraged him to explain. He had been ready to step onto the first tread, he stammered, when he glanced to the top of the stairs. There on the landing stood a man with his head turned slightly to one side. His manner was gentle, and the trace of a smile formed on his lips. The man stood still and stared down at the youth. He spoke not a word. Although the figure at the top of the stairway was of medium height and stocky, the young boy said he nevertheless seemed as light as a feather. Immediately, the adults rushed to the stairway to investigate. They're probably like, who's in the house? No one else was thought to be upstairs, and no figure appeared before them. Several men climbed the stairs and examined the bedrooms. They opened closet doors and peered under beds. They even looked behind curtains and in antique trunks at the foot of the beds. Without doubt, the rooms and hallway were empty. Back in the parlor, the adults questioned the young boy further. What exactly had he seen? On close examination, he described a stocky man decked out in a dark blue uniform with brass buttons. The man wore a captain's hat with a shiny black bell. His trousers were neatly pressed and his shoes were polished to a luster. It was clear, although the youngster had never seen his uncle in his lightkeeper's uniform, he described Captain Joe perfectly. Apparently, Joseph Merritt Burris, or at least his spirit, had returned to his beloved home one last time before departing forever, the family reasoned. And now a little break for a word about one of our sponsors.
We visited the British Cemetery, which is the final resting spot for 4 sailors from the HMT Bedfordshire, which was torpedoed on May 11, 1942. These were the only bodies recovered from the attack. Many hurricanes have blown through the island, with the most recent being Dorian in 2019. These storms have changed the topography of the island, and there have been many man-made changes. In earlier years, the island was separated by 2 streams called Big Gut and Little Gut. This divided the village into 2 groups called the Creekers and the Pointers. This wasn't about political class or station in life, but rather about location, and a friendly rivalry developed that continues today, even though the Navy filled in the creeks in 1942 when they dredged to make it easier for their ships to get around. Other things that changed the island is that people really like to move the houses around.
You know, Kelly, we hear stories about moving these Victorian mansions around and we're always stunned. I can't believe they were doing that here on the island as well.
So many times, too.
Yeah, there were some houses that she's like, well, this house had originally been there and then it was over there and then they brought it over here.
How do you bizarre.
Move these houses that much and not have them kind of crumble? We stayed at the Pony Island Inn, which was in the middle of the village, and enjoyed some great food and local brews at the 1718 Brewing. Very good beer.
It was very good. The food was, too.
It was. Night came and we headed off to the village craftsman, and Philip's daughter Amy took us through the village and shared several of the haunted locations with us. The former Oddfellows Hall is one of the places that has been moved around on the island and is the last Greek revival structure on the island. It was just undergoing some refurbishment when we stood outside of it, and no one is sure exactly what its next iteration would be. This 2-story building was built in 1901 by Charlie Scarborough, who bought the property from James and Zilphia Howard. This became Ocracoke Lodge number 194, Independent Order of Oddfellows. The lodge was on the 2nd floor, and the 1st floor was used as a public school. The building was sold as a private residence in 1917. During World War II, the upper floor became home for naval officers. After the war, wings were added to the building and it was opened as the Silver Lake Inn. This was one of the island's first modern hotels with running water, electricity, and indoor plumbing. This became the social center of the village. Years later, the business became Island Inn. It closed under foreclosure in 2010 and was reopened again, but then closed again in 2015. The Ocracoke Preservation Society bought the building in 2018 and removed it from the wing, so now it's just the original house that it was, and placed it in a new spot on new pilings in 2021, which is how it is still today. The building is said to be haunted by a ghost called Mrs. Godfrey. A guest told Philip Howard the following story in his book, Digging Up Uncle Evans. She'd had a whole day of exploring the island, and she'd returned to the hotel lobby and climbed the antique stairway to her second-floor accommodations. At the entrance to her room, she retrieved the key from her purse and slowly opened the door. It was quiet inside. A delicate breeze wafted through the open window and gently rustled the lace curtains. She was exhausted. The old iron bed, piled high with soft pillows and a cozy quilt, beckoned to her, but she could not sleep yet. Her mind raced with images of sailors, pirates, and simple island folk who'd called Ocracoke home for generations. What was it like, she wondered, to live here so far from conventional civilization? Who had built this fine hotel, and what stories did it hold? Finally, too tired to think anymore, she prepared for bed and turned in about an hour before midnight. Several hours later, she was roused from a deep sleep. She had the distinct sensation that someone was holding on to her big toe. She forced herself awake, afraid at first to open her eyes, fearful of what she might see. With trepidation, she lifted her head slowly and opened her eyes. Instantly, the sensation vanished. No one was standing at the foot of her bed, and no hand grasped her toe. The curtains were still. Convinced it had merely been a disquieting dream, she drifted back to sleep, only to be awakened a second time with the identical sensation. Again, no person, no figure presented itself, and the pressure on her toe disappeared the moment she opened her eyes. After the third encounter with whatever was holding on to her toe, the woman propped herself on her pillows and determined to stay awake until daybreak. In the morning, she requested to be moved to one of the inn's newer rooms on the other side of the street. After hearing the stories of Mrs. Godfrey, she said she knew who had been tormenting her that night. And what happened to Mrs. Godfrey, people aren't quite sure who committed it, but she was murdered in a horrible way. Apparently, she and her husband didn't get along so well. There was this guy named Stanley Wahab who was running the inn, and he hired a couple from the mainland to act as managers for his growing hotel. They took an apartment in the hotel, and although they were capable employees, they soon became well known on the island for their domestic squabbles. Everybody knew about it because everybody could hear them screaming at each other all the time. Islanders remember them fighting like cats and dogs. It became an embarrassment, actually, to a lot of Ocracokers, and you can imagine they've got people staying at the inn, and these people are screaming at each other. In those days, all the roads on Ocracoke were primitive sandy lanes. Ferry service was nothing more than a vague dream. Ocracoke's primary link to the mainland was by mailboat. It was that mailboat we mentioned earlier. It was the 42-foot Alita. It could carry several dozen passengers, so it wasn't just mail. It would take people back and forth, too. So one morning, the manager's wife boarded the Alita for a trip across the Sound to visit some family and friends. Or at least that's what he told everyone. Several days later, at the time of her scheduled return, she was conspicuously absent among the passengers disembarking from the mailboat when it arrived back home at Ocracoke. The manager seemed perplexed, but not overly concerned. So he gets down there, he's like, my wife wasn't on that one. Oh, well, I guess she'll be on the next one.
I'll just go home now.
This continues on for several days. He goes on down as the mailboat is coming in the afternoon, and my wife's not on there. Oh, well, not too worried about it. Goes back. He was a heavy drinker, which is probably why they fought a lot, and he's been drinking a lot, probably for a reason. A week later, to everyone's horror, the woman's mutilated body was discovered on the mainland, the victim of a horrible murder. Lying face up in a pool of blood in an abandoned house, her throat had been cut. Although suspicion immediately centered on an unidentified serviceman who had been seen getting into a car with her, her murderer was never determined. But there were a lot of people who looked over at Mr. Godfrey and went, did he manage to get himself over there? Here's how he would have had to pull it off. He would have had to row his own boat all the way over to the mainland, wherever his wife was, get over there, kill her, and then row himself back without anybody seeing him doing it. But they clearly did not have a lot of love for each other.
Yeah, by the dark of night, too, I might add.
So over the years now, there are reports about Mrs. Godfrey's ghost regularly patrolling rooms and hallways of the Island Inn, at least when it was the Island Inn. I'm sure it will still continue to do so with whatever it becomes in the future. Most sightings have occurred on the second and third floors of the main section, and it wasn't uncommon for guests who had never heard the story to approach the front desk in the morning with strange tales of doors opening and closing, disembodied footsteps padding around in the middle of the night, or bathroom spigots turning on by themselves.
The James Henry Garish House was another stop for us. This was a home built by a descendant of one of the original settlers to the island, Henry Garish. When James passed in 1947, the house was sold out of the family. The house was rented as a summer rental, and renters started reporting odd activity. Pictures on the walls would be hanging upside down. The house was remodeled and added onto with an L-shaped addition of 3 rooms. A rear porch was enclosed and turned into a hallway. which made the interior of the house get a little weird. Amy explains that to us and shares the haunting experience of one man who stayed in the house.
The heat issues. Eventually, again, though, they decided that really wasn't convenient. They had to go outside through mosquitoes and rains and whatnot. So they turned that porch into a hallway. They closed it off, but they didn't upgrade anything inside. So you still have exterior siding inside, and you still have exterior windows on those bedrooms with full glass panes where you're walking by the bedrooms and you can just look in everybody's bedrooms down the line. That hallway where people who've stayed in those bedrooms have reported hearing and seeing things walk past those windows. There was a fellow who stayed here in the early 1990s. He was new to the area. He was doing work for the neighbors to help renovate the house. Neighbors had owned it at the time. And he said he was sound asleep in his bedroom, in one of those middle bedrooms, and he woke up with a start, with the feeling that someone was in the house. But he wasn't really sure what to do about it. He was new to the island and, that feeling, but do you act on the feeling or not? Is it just something you've woken up with? Whatever. He lay in bed, kind of using his senses, trying to figure out what was going on when he started hearing footsteps coming down the hallway towards his bedroom, which he really didn't know what to do then. So he lay very still, pretended he was asleep, which I'm sure we all have done at a time or two. Had his eyes closed, but kind of half slit, peering out through the sides of his eyes. And as the footsteps got closer and closer and passed by his window, he said he realized it wasn't a live human that was in the house. It was an apparition of someone passing by his window that he was watching. He said he really didn't know what to do then. He just lay in bed, hoping they hadn't noticed him, trying to figure out what his next is. Does he bolt out of the house? Does he pretend he's not there? I don't know. He said the footsteps got all the way to the end of the hall. He could hear him stop and turn around and just start to come back down the hallway. They actually stopped at his bedroom window and peered in his bedroom at him, pulled their head back out, and continued to walk on down the hallway. He said when the footsteps stopped, it felt like they were about at the parlor again. It was about the same sound as when they had started. And he all of a sudden lost the sensation that anyone was in the house after the footsteps stopped. So he had laid in bed for a few more minutes just to kind of assess the situation, and finally felt confident enough to get up out of bed and walk through the house looking for signs of anyone really having been in there. Maybe he was just imagining it being a ghost. He said the doors were exactly the way he had left them. There were no footprints in the house. It appeared that everything was identical to when he went to bed. He did not last long on Ocracoke. After that, he decided that it was time, that was maybe his sign to head on off the island. As far as I know, he's never been back either.
The beaches are amazing here. And speaking of them, there are a couple of hauntings that are connected to the beach. This is from Howard's book, Howard Street Hauntings and Other Stories. In the summer of 2008, Jay, a frequent visitor to Ocracoke, shared a disquieting story. He'd been vacationing on the island almost every summer since childhood. More recently, he had introduced his wife and small children to Ocracoke. Everyone loved the quiet isolation of the island. Jay especially enjoyed beachcombing and had discovered the best time to search for shells and other valuables was at low tide. One morning, he arose at 3 o'clock, donned a t-shirt, shorts, and sneakers, and headed on down to the beach. He had a canvas bag and flashlight with him. He walked along the surf, glancing up occasionally to admire the profusion of stars glittering in the darkened sky, but mostly he concentrated his flashlight beam just below the high tide line. It was there that he found Scotch bonnets, olive shells, small whelks, bits of coral, and even an intact sand dollar now and then.
Nice.
Now I'm like,
Love
we should
it.
have gone beachcombing at 3 o'clock in the morning, Kelly. After walking more than a mile, he suddenly heard a child giggling. Startled, Jay stopped and whirled around, probing the darkness with his light. No child frolicked nearby. By all measures, he was alone. It must have been his imagination, he reasoned, but he was unsettled. It was time to return to his family. Jay turned and began walking back toward the village. Then he heard the child's laughter once more. Again he searched, thinking that a wayward child had wandered from the nearby campground. Finally convinced there was no child in the vicinity, he shone his light on his own footprints and proceeded warily in the direction from which he had come. Suddenly, he stopped in his tracks. He could hardly believe his eyes. There, superimposed inside his own prints, he could see the tread of his soles, were the impressions of a child's bare feet. Whoa. Careful inspection confirmed his most dreaded fear. The child's footprints appeared from nowhere, continued for a dozen feet, then disappeared abruptly. No tracks led from the dunes to the beach, nor led away from the surf. They simply appeared suddenly, followed him as he looked for shells, then after rattling him with a playful laugh, vanished.
That's a pretty cool story.
That's a very cool story. And this next one is even cooler. You guys are going to love this one. Okay, so this is a story about a husband and wife who decided to buy a boat. It's John and Anne is originally from Denmark. They got a 42-foot Griffin ketch, and they decided that they were going to take the boat over to Denmark. They lived on the west coast, so they were going to go down through the Panama Canal and then go back up the east coast. That's how they're going to end up in the Outer Banks. They'd been having a little bit of trouble when they got over to Cuba, so they came back over towards the American mainland to get some repairs done, and so that's why they were kind of making their way up the North Carolina coast there and ended up right outside of Ocracoke. Well, this storm comes out of nowhere, and they're like, we're having some issues. I don't know that we're going to be able to make it in or not. Their bowsprit breaks, so they have like no way of kind of directing themselves, but their engine is still working, the radio's still working. So they call in to the Coast Guard, and they're like, we're having some trouble. We need some help. Well, this storm is so bad that the Coast Guard is like, is everybody okay on board? Is your engine running? Checking to make sure they had other safety stuff. And they're like, okay, well, really the best for everyone involved so that nobody dies is that we wait until this calms down before we come and get you. If you do lose your engine, call us again and we will come and get you. So John and Anne are sitting here in their boat. You can only imagine how panicked they are. She's 6 months pregnant at the time, and they have their little daughter with them as well. Well, along comes this freighter, and it comes up right next to them. And they get this voice that comes over their radio, and it's, static. And the guy introduces himself and says that he's the captain. And they were like, oh,
thank
we're
goodness.
having some trouble here. We don't know if you guys can really help us, but if there's anything you can do. So what the captain did is he brought the freighter so it was right next to their boat, and it blocked a lot of the wind. It calmed the waves for them so that they weren't getting battered around. And throughout the evening, he continues to radio them and check in with them and make sure that they're okay and that everything's fine. And John thinks it's kind of strange that they didn't see any crew like hanging over the edges or doing anything on the boat. Of course, it is a bad storm, so you kind of don't want to be out in the open. You don't want to get knocked off the ship. But he did think it was a little bit weird that they hadn't seen any kind of a crew or anything like that. By daybreak, the gale was diminishing, and John and Anne, both exhausted, realized that they had survived a terrifying storm in one of the most dangerous sections of ocean on the planet. And if you've seen any of the maps that they have of the shipwrecks along the Outer Banks,
it's crazy.
There's nowhere along there that doesn't have a shipwreck. Their boat was still crippled with a broken bowsprit. John contacted the Coast Guard again and explained his plight. He was assured that a cutter would be on its way shortly to guide the Sequest, which was the name of their ship, to safe harbor in Ocracoke, Silver Lake. On hearing the radio transmission, the freighter captain contacted John one more time. Since the wind and waves had subsided, he said, we really have to get our shipment out there. We're going to go ahead and leave. Sounds like you guys are going to be okay. So they leave, and the Coast Guard vessel shows up a little bit after that. And they didn't even see the freighter. It had already gotten away from that area by the time the Coast Guard gets there. So they hook up the boat, they tow it back to Ocracoke. And once they get the boat securely tied to the dock, the weary and shaken couple stepped ashore with their 6-year-old daughter, grateful to be alive. The Coast Guard captain, after being assured that all were well and uninjured, explained that a thorough investigation would wait a moment. First, he had a question about something that perplexed him. As we approached this morning, the captain began, we heard you talking on the radio. It was odd, he continued, because we could only hear your part of the conversation, and it became obvious that you were communicating with the captain of another vessel. Whenever we expected to hear a response, there was only silence. Who were you talking with? John explained their ordeal in detail, with praises for the freighter captain for his commitment to protect one small sailboat and for his frequent calls on the radio to assure himself that John and his family were safe and to offer encouragement. The Coast Guard captain was intrigued but perplexed. I don't understand why we couldn't hear the other half of the conversation, he said. But it's stranger than that, he continued. We never had any other vessel on our radar. When we approached this morning, we saw your tiny sailboat on our radar screen, but there was no freighter. I don't understand, he repeated as he fell silent. The two rescued sailors, their small daughter, and the Coast Guardsman stood on the dock facing each other, unsure of what this meant. For John and Anne, the previous day was beginning to take on mysterious dimensions. Finally, the captain ventured another question. Did you get the name of the freighter, he asked. Well, John replied, the experience was so traumatic that it never occurred to me to ask the captain his name, let alone the name of his vessel. We talked periodically throughout the night, of course, but he never offered any identification, and I never thought to ask. We were too busy simply trying to survive. But I actually do know the name of the freighter. As dawn was breaking and the storm quieted down and we heard the Coast Guard transmission on our radio, the freighter captain explained that he needed to continue his voyage. He had freight that must be delivered and time was slipping by. The sun was just rising above the horizon as the freighter turned north and proceeded on its way. For the first time, I paid close attention to the ship and I caught a glimpse of her stern. There, painted in huge black letters, I read the name USS Potomac. The Coast Guardsman fell silent once more and stared hard at John, deep in thought. Finally, he offered one last comment. The Potomac, he remarked, almost to himself, sank offshore almost exactly 1 year ago. We never found any wreckage or trace of her, and there were no survivors. She just disappeared, never to be heard from again until last night, he added in a whisper. What a great story.
That's awesome.
And again, it's like this physicality. The boat was there.
Right.
It was physical enough that it protected the little sailboat.
Absolutely.
And the captain was still with it. I don't know where the rest of the crew was. And that it was the whole night. It wasn't just like it showed up for 5 minutes and he kept radioing them like this was really happening. How the hell? I mean, it's those stories that make me go, what is happening here? This isn't just a time, space, we're in the same place.
Slip.
kind of thing. Or if it was, it is weird. It's just crazy. Love those stories. Then it was time for us to get off of Ocracoke, Kelly.
The next morning, we headed to the ferry for Hatteras Island early. There are 7 towns that make up the island of Hatteras: Rodanthe, Waves, Salvo, Avon, Frisco, Buxton, and Hatteras. There have been humans on the island since at least 500 AD, and some historians believe that the colonists from Roanoke may have ended up here eventually. European settlers arrived in the 1700s. The island was originally called Hatterask for the indigenous people that were there first. During the Civil War, the Confederates built 2 forts on the island. The Union Army won its first victory in the Battle of Hatteras Inlet, and they would control the island. Freed slaves came to the island in 1862 and lived in barracks there that became known as the Hotel des Afriques. This was the first safe place for escaped slaves in North Carolina and was part of the Underground Railroad. Ferries used to be the only form of transport to the island, but the Bonner Bridge was built in 1963, and that made it so people could drive to the island. That bridge was replaced with the Mark Basnight Bridge in 2019. U.S. life-saving stations soon dotted the island, and the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was built. The U.S. weather station in Hatteras would receive the initial telegraph that the Titanic was sinking.
And the Titanic comes up again.
Yes, indeed.
The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was unfortunately completely surrounded by scaffolding when we visited, so we weren't able to take a very cool picture of it.
I've never seen anything like that. I mean, obviously, what else would you do to refurbish it? But you would need that scaffolding, but oh my gosh, it was so bizarre looking.
Yeah, well, imagine how they used to paint it. These lighthouses, they would just be on a rope going up and down.
I'd rather not, thank you very much.
I'd much rather have the scaffolding. Although, for us, it was kind of easy for us to envision what it probably looks like without the scaffolding because it has the same black and white candy cane striping as the St. Augustine Lighthouse.
Indeed, it does.
Looks exactly the same. This is the tallest brick lighthouse in the world, rising to 208 feet. So it might look like the St. Augustine Lighthouse, but it's taller than it. This wasn't the first lighthouse here. The first was built in 1803 and made from sandstone and rose 90 feet. This lighthouse was a complete failure as its sandstone color blended in with the environment, and the tower, 90 feet, that was way too short. In 1853, 60 feet were added to the tower, so it stood 150 feet. The top portion was painted red with white at the base. A first-order Fresnel lens was added as well. In the 1860s, it was decided a new lighthouse was needed. This one was completed in 1870 and had been built on a floating foundation because of the high water table. 6-foot by 12-foot yellow pine timbers were laid crossways below the water table, and granite rock layers were placed on top of the timbers. The base is octagon-shaped and made from brick and granite and painted red. It's just gorgeous. The black and white striping pattern of the tower was added in 1873.
The lamp was electrified in 1934. Beach erosion forced the closure of the lighthouse, and the beacon was moved to a skeletal steel tower the following year. By 1950, the beach had built back up, and the lighthouse was reopened. But the beach would erode again, and an ambitious decision was made. The lighthouse was going to be moved.
Now, we talk about moving these Victorian houses is crazy. Imagine moving a huge lighthouse made of stone. These people.
The museum had an entire room dedicated to this undertaking, and amazingly, the lighthouse was moved 2,900 feet to its present location over 23 days in 1999. On top of that, the oil house, principal keeper's quarters, double keeper's quarters, and dwelling cisterns were all moved. The U.S. Coast Guard maintains the light, while the National Park Services takes care of the lighthouse and buildings. This lighthouse is haunted by a ghost cat. It matches the lighthouse as it is said to be black and white. The cat appears as a full-bodied apparition that rubs on visitors' legs, and they quickly realize it is a spirit when they reach down to pet it, and it disappears. There are also a couple of stories of a male apparition named Bob who wears a yellow raincoat.
I didn't feel any kitty cats there. Bummer.
I know.
There's also a mystery story connected to the lighthouse in Hatteras Island. In January of 1921, a 5-masted commercial schooner named the Carroll A. Deering was found run aground just off Cape Hatteras. This isn't strange considering that the Outer Banks is the graveyard of the Atlantic, of course. What was strange is that the ship was missing its entire crew of 12. The lifeboats were gone. When the Coast Guard boarded the ship, there was no question that the crew had left in a hurry. Food had been prepared but was untouched. The sails were set, and the boat was in good condition until it was torn up by the Diamond Shoals as it sat off Cape Hatteras. The crew and lifeboats were never found. What had happened to them? Did bad weather force them from the schooner? Did pirates attack? Did some other crew of men force them from the ship? To this day, no one knows, but there are theories. We don't think pirates were involved because why wouldn't they take the ship for themselves?
True.
I mean, that's what pirates did. They took ships. That's how Blackbeard got the Queen Anne's revenge. He took the ship. If there'd been a mutiny on the ship, which is another possibility or theory, surely the mutineers would have taken the ship.
Of course.
Pop the captain over the rail and you just go and do your thing. A message in a bottle was found by a man off the North Carolina coast in April 1921. It read, "Deering captured by oil-burning boat." After that, newspapers ran with stories that a Bolshevik plot to steal cargo and ships had hit the Deering. Many of our listeners probably wondered if the man who found that message was being honest, because I kind of did. I'm like,
yeah,
he just happens to find this message in a bottle.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't. He later admitted that he wrote the message. Even though the Bermuda Triangle wouldn't be a thing until several decades later, people have wondered if it was responsible for this, because we are kind of in that Bermuda Triangle area here. A Coast Guard captain at the time had the most reasonable answer. He believed the ship had become stuck in a storm and the crew decided to row the 9 miles to shore aboard the lifeboats, but the ocean was too rough and the boats didn't survive, meaning, of course, the crew didn't survive as well. That's probably what happened, but I'd rather believe that it was aliens.
Many listeners have heard of the Gray Man of Polly's Island, and we have covered it for a moment in Oddity. This is a figure that is a harbinger of doom. Well, apparently, Hatteras Island has a Gray Man as well. The legend goes that a man named Gray was killed by a sudden storm near Cape Point. Now, whenever a storm is threatening the area, the Gray Man shows up on the beach between Cape Point and the Hatteras Lighthouse. In 1966, a hurricane was on the outskirts of Cape Hatteras and heading that way. The Coast Guard went out to warn residents to leave or batten down the hatches. After they were done, one of the newer Coast Guard members spotted a man down on the beach. This figure appeared gray and was waving its arms and pointing. Before one of his fellow guardsmen could stop him, he ran towards the beach to help this person. Just before he reached the man disappeared. The Coast Guardsman looked all around like, where did this guy go? When he got back to the rest of the crew who were waiting for him in a vehicle, they informed him that what he had just seen was the Gray Man of Hatteras. A picture was captured of the Gray Man during Hurricane Isabel in 2003.
I'll see if I can find that picture. I, so far, have not been able to find it. We'll see. Does it really look like a ghost down there? Be hard to tell. If there's somebody on a beach in a hurricane,
well, true,
they're going to look gray, and they'd be waving their arms because they're like, I'm going to die. One of the most well-known legends connected to Hatteras Island is the story of Hatteras Jack. Hatteras Jack was apparently a white dolphin, and sailors claimed he had the soul of a sailor who had lost his life at sea. The treacherous waters were hard to navigate, of course, and the story goes that Hatteras Jack was good at guiding ships to safety. The dolphin would circle a ship to get its attention and then lead the way when it was safe. Some ships would blow their foghorn to call Hatteras Jack. After he guided a ship to safety, he would jump through the air and even walk on his tail as if celebrating. As time passed, technology improved and the need for Hatteras Jack went away, and he seemed to go away too. People believe that the sailor's soul was now at rest. I also saw some stories that they think he took off to Australia and was helping ships down there too.
The lower islands of the Outer Banks are both beautiful and crowded during the summer season. Many people love to spend their summer vacations here. And then there are the bankers who call the Outer Banks home. Both residents and visitors have experienced strange things. Are any of these legends based in fact? Are the lower islands of the Outer Banks haunted?
That is for you to decide. The Outer Banks are gorgeous. You really need to go there. The only thing that was a bummer for us is that we're having a horrible drought in Florida. We're finally getting some rain. I think a lot of the country's been experiencing it. The Outer Banks is getting it too. So where there would normally be like water, it was very, very muddy. And the green grass was all very brown. So it wasn't as green and beautiful as it could have been.
Yeah, but it was still really pretty.
Yeah, and I think that Jared had a good time there. One of the reasons we went, I don't know if any of you have seen the series Outer Banks on Netflix, but that was one of the reasons why he wanted to go check it out.
Indeed.
We'd love to have you check out our website at historygoesbump.com. And if you'd like to send us some feedback, you can do that at historygoesbump@gmail.com. I want to thank you guys for joining us for this episode. I've been your host, Diane.
And this has been Kelly.
You take care now.
Bye-bye.
This episode is brought to you by our executive producers.
Join me in the cemetery by becoming an executive producer. You can join on Patreon or PayPal. Check out the Support the Show tab on the website for more information.
The Cape Hatteras National Seashore. Seashore. Yes, I have such a hard time when I have she and shore together. A message was found by a man in a bottle off the North Carolina coast in April 19...
A message was found by a man in a bottle. Might need to switch some words around, darling.
Oh, okay, I wrote that sentence a little strangely, apparently. You're like, wait, what?
And you were just reading right on like, la-di-da, la-di-da.
I know what I meant. I'm sure the listeners do too. It wasn't a man in a bottle, so... A Coast Guard captain at the time had the most reasonable answer. He believed the ship had become stuck in a storm and the crew decided to row the 9 miles to shore aboard the lifeboats, but the ocean was too rough and the boats didn't survive, meaning, of course, the crew didn't survive as well. That's probably what happened, but I'd rather believe that it was aliens.
Or a little man in a bottle.
It was the man in the bottle. He took the
little
boat.
man.
The man in the bottle took the crew. That was it. Yes, he was the alien. That's why he could fit in a bottle.
Okay.
Aliens
he just wiggled his nose like Tabitha.
Sure. Okay, now we're talking genies. It was a djinn. We have all kinds of theories, folks.